The sign didn't lie. It really said Shades of Death Road, 7 miles of twisting asphalt in New Jersey where time breaks, radios die, and drivers vanish. And when trucker Bobby Kane took that route last October, he realized some roads don't take you home. Welcome to the Long Road Stories. I'm Hank, and tonight we're driving into one of America's darkest roads. If you love true highway horror, hit subscribe and tell me what state you're watching from below. Now buckle up. This isn't folklore. This is documented history, and what one trucker saw here changed everything. The location you're about to learn about has been called the most haunted road in New Jersey, and possibly one of the most haunted roads in the entire United States. Shades of Death Road runs for approximately 7 miles through Warren County in northwestern New Jersey, connecting the towns of Great Meadows and Hope. The road itself is narrow, winding, heavily wooded, and isolated, despite being located in one of the most densely populated states in America. The name Shades of Death has been used for this road since at least the late 1700s, though the exact origin of the name is disputed. Some historians believe it refers to the dense tree canopy that blocks sunlight and creates perpetual shade. Others point to the multiple tragedies that have occurred on the road over the centuries. What isn't disputed is the road's history of violence, disease, and unexplained phenomena that continues to this day. During the Prohibition era of the 1920s and 30s, the road was used by bootleggers and criminals who preyed on travelers, resulting in numerous incidents of violence and loss of life. The area surrounding the road, particularly the swampy regions near what's now called Ghost Lake, experienced deadly outbreaks of malaria transmitted by mosquitoes, claiming many lives in the local community. And since at least the mid-20th century, the road has been the site of consistent paranormal reports, apparitions, unexplained lights, electronic malfunctions, and the sensation of being watched or followed by unseen presences. This is the story of Robert Kane's encounter with Shades of Death Road on a specific night in October, and what he experienced during those hours that would forever change his understanding of what's possible. Robert Kane, everyone called him Bobby, had been driving commercial trucks for 45 years, starting when he was just 21 years old and fresh out of community college. He'd driven every type of rig, hauled every type of cargo, traveled every major highway and countless minor roads across all 48 continental states. Bobby was the kind of driver who'd accumulated millions of miles, who could navigate by instinct and experience, who knew which rest stops had the best coffee and which routes to avoid during specific seasons. He was practical, skeptical, and thoroughly unimpressed by ghost stories or urban legends. Over the years, other drivers had told him about supposedly haunted roads, mysterious hitchhikers, unexplained phenomena, and Bobby had always smiled politely and assumed they were either exaggerating, misinterpreting natural phenomena, or pulling his leg. Bobby had never experienced anything on the road that he couldn't explain through mechanical issues, weather conditions, fatigue, or simple coincidence. That comfortable skepticism was about to be completely shattered on a clear October evening in 2024, when Bobby accepted what should have been a routine delivery job. Bobby had been planning to head home to Pennsylvania after completing a delivery in northern New Jersey, looking forward to a few days off before his next scheduled haul. But his dispatcher called with an urgent request. A customer in the town of Hope needed a specific piece of manufacturing equipment delivered by the following morning, and Bobby was the only driver in position to make the delivery on time. The job paid well enough that Bobby agreed despite his fatigue and his desire to get home. The dispatcher gave him the delivery address and suggested he take Route 80 to Interstate 87, which would be the fastest route. But as Bobby studied his GPS and road maps, he noticed that there was a more direct route, a back road that would shave about 20 minutes off his travel time if he was willing to navigate some rural roads instead of staying on the highway system. That back road was Shades of Death Road. Bobby had heard the name before. It was locally famous enough that most New Jersey residents knew about it, but he'd never actually driven it. He pulled up some quick information on his phone and read about the road's reputation for being haunted, about Ghost Lake and Fairy Hole Cave, about all the legends and stories. Bobby laughed to himself. After 45 years of driving without encountering anything supernatural, he certainly wasn't going to be spooked by some rural road with an ominous name. He programmed the route into his GPS, started his truck, and headed toward Shades of Death Road as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Bobby reached the intersection where Shades of Death Road began around 6:30 in the evening. The sun was still up but getting low, casting long shadows through the dense forest that lined both sides of the road. The actual road sign reading Shades of Death Odd was right there, official and permanent, bolted to a post exactly like any other road sign in New Jersey. Bobby took a photo of it with his phone, something to show friends back home, a novelty, and then turned his truck onto the narrow road. Immediately, Bobby noticed how different the road felt from the highway he'd just left. The pavement was older, more weathered, with visible patches and repairs that suggested decades of neglect. The road was barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass comfortably, with no shoulder to speak of, just asphalt and then immediately forest on both sides. The trees grew so densely that they created a canopy overhead, blocking much of the remaining sunlight and creating the shade that gave the road part of its name. Bobby drove carefully, maintaining a moderate speed, navigating the curves and bends that seemed to come every few hundred feet. The road was deserted. Bobby hadn't seen another vehicle since turning onto it. That struck him as slightly odd, given that this was New Jersey, one of the most populated states, but he assumed the road simply wasn't used much by local traffic. About 2 miles into his journey down Shades of Death Road, Bobby began noticing things that seemed slightly off, slightly wrong, though he couldn't immediately articulate what was bothering him. The light seemed wrong. It was darker under the tree canopy than it should have been given the time of day. The temperature seemed to have dropped significantly. Bobby's cab thermometer showed it was 58 degrees, which was considerably cooler than the 70-degree temperature he'd been experiencing just minutes earlier, before turning onto this road. The radio in his truck, which had been playing clearly, started experiencing interference, not complete static, but a rhythmic buzzing sound that came and went in waves, almost like breathing. Bobby adjusted the radio, changed stations, but the interference persisted on every frequency. He considered that maybe the terrain or tree cover was affecting reception, though that didn't quite make sense given that he was still in New Jersey, not in some remote mountain region with poor signal coverage. Bobby's GPS was also behaving strangely. The map showed him traveling on Shades of Death Road, which was correct, but the remaining distance to his destination kept fluctuating. It would show 3 miles remaining, then suddenly jump to 5 miles, then drop to 2 miles, as if the GPS couldn't determine his actual position or calculate his route properly. Bobby found this annoying but not particularly alarming. Electronics malfunction sometimes. That's just reality when you're dealing with complex systems. At approximately the 3-mile mark, Bobby passed a body of water on his right, a small lake surrounded by dead trees and swampy vegetation. He'd read about this on his phone earlier. Ghost Lake, also known as Jenny Jump Lake, a body of water with its own set of legends and paranormal associations. According to local history, the lake had been a breeding ground for malaria-carrying mosquitoes in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and many residents in the surrounding area had contracted the disease and perished. The lake was also said to be a dumping ground for victims during the Prohibition era, though Bobby didn't know if that was documented fact or simply part of the road's mythology. What Bobby did notice, however, was how unnatural the lake looked. The water was completely still, not a ripple, not a wave, despite the fact that there was clearly wind moving through the trees overhead. The surface of the water was dark, almost black, reflecting the trees around it in a way that made it difficult to distinguish between the water and the forest. And there were no birds. Bobby realized with a start that he hadn't heard or seen a single bird since entering Shades of Death Road, which was profoundly unusual for a heavily forested area. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of his truck's engine and that strange, rhythmic interference on his radio. As Bobby continued driving past Ghost Lake, his headlights now on as the darkness under the tree canopy deepened, he saw something that made him instinctively touch his brakes. Standing on the right side of the road, perhaps 50 feet ahead of his truck, was a figure. A man dressed in what appeared to be clothing from the early 20th century, a dark suit, a hat, standing perfectly still, facing the road. Bobby's first thought was that this was someone whose vehicle had broken down, someone who needed help. But as Bobby's truck approached and his headlights illuminated the figure more clearly, Bobby realized something was profoundly wrong. The man wasn't moving at all, not shifting his weight, not gesturing for help, not reacting to the approach of a large truck. And the man was transparent, not completely see-through, but definitely not solid. Bobby could see the trees behind the figure, could see through the figure's torso to the forest beyond. Bobby's rational mind immediately tried to explain what he was seeing. A trick of the light, shadows, a mannequin someone had placed as a prank. But as his truck drew alongside the figure, as Bobby looked directly at it from a distance of perhaps 10 feet, the figure turned its head and looked directly at Bobby. Eye contact. Unmistakable, direct eye contact with something that shouldn't exist. And then the figure simply dissolved, fading from visibility over the course of perhaps 2 seconds, until there was nothing standing on the roadside except empty forest. Bobby's truck began experiencing problems immediately after the apparition vanished. The engine, which had been running smoothly, developed a roughness, a stuttering quality, as if it wasn't getting proper fuel or ignition. The dashboard lights flickered. The GPS screen went completely black for several seconds before rebooting. And most disturbingly, Bobby's steering became stiff, resistant, as if the power steering had failed. Bobby, drawing on decades of experience with mechanical issues, tried to diagnose the problem while continuing to drive. But nothing he did, checking gauges, trying different switch positions, adjusting controls, had any effect. The truck continued to run, but poorly, and Bobby found himself having to apply significantly more force to the steering wheel to navigate the road's curves. Bobby considered pulling over to inspect the truck, but the road had no safe place to stop. No shoulder, no widening, just narrow asphalt with forest immediately adjacent. Bobby decided to push through to his destination, which according to his malfunctioning GPS was only a few more miles ahead, but those few miles were becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. As Bobby drove deeper into Shades of Death Road, he began seeing more figures. Not just one apparition, but multiple ones appearing at irregular intervals along the roadside. Some were standing, some were walking along the road's edge, some were simply present for a moment before vanishing. They all shared certain characteristics. They wore clothing from the early to mid-20th century. They moved in ways that seemed slightly wrong, too smooth, too gliding, not quite matching normal human movement. And they all appeared translucent, not fully solid. Bobby counted at least 8 distinct figures over the course of perhaps 15 minutes of driving. Some appeared to be men in suits. Others appeared to be women in period dresses. One figure appeared to be a law enforcement officer from the 1920s or 30s, complete with badge and uniform. Bobby's skepticism was being systematically destroyed by direct sensory evidence that contradicted everything he thought he understood about reality. These weren't tricks of light. They weren't hallucinations brought on by fatigue. Bobby was completely alert, completely lucid, and he was seeing things that officially couldn't exist. The figures weren't threatening, they didn't approach his truck, didn't try to interfere with his progress. But their presence was deeply unsettling, creating a sense that Bobby had somehow left normal reality and entered a place where different rules applied. At what Bobby estimated was the 5-mile mark of Shades of Death Road, his headlights illuminated a small clearing on the left side of the road. where there was a dirt parking area and a trail leading into the forest. A weathered wooden sign indicated that this was the entrance to Fairy Hole Cave. Bobby had read about this location earlier, a small cave that was part of the road's mythology, said to be used by bandits as a hideout during the Prohibition era, and more recently associated with paranormal phenomena. People reported seeing strange lights emanating from the cave, hearing voices when no one was present, experiencing time distortion where hours passed in what felt like minutes. Bobby had no intention of exploring the cave. He just wanted to complete his delivery and get away from this increasingly disturbing road. But as his truck passed the parking area, Bobby felt something he'd never experienced before. A compulsion, a pull, an overwhelming urge to stop his truck and investigate the cave. It wasn't his own desire. Bobby had no curiosity about the cave and actively wanted to avoid it. But the compulsion was so strong that Bobby found his foot moving toward the brake pedal involuntarily, found his hands beginning to turn the steering wheel toward the parking area. Bobby fought against the compulsion, actually said out loud, "No, absolutely not," and forced himself to keep driving straight. The compulsion faded after he'd passed the cave entrance, but the experience left Bobby shaken. Something about this road, something about this location, was actively trying to influence him, trying to get him to do things he wouldn't normally do. Bobby checked his phone to see what time it was, expecting it to be around 7 or 7:15, based on when he'd entered Shades of Death Road and how long he estimated he'd been driving. His phone showed 8:47. Bobby stared at the time, convinced it was wrong. He checked the truck's dashboard clock, which confirmed 8:47 p.m. Bobby had somehow lost over an hour. He'd been on Shades of Death Road for over 2 hours, driving what should have been a 7-mile stretch of road that should have taken perhaps 15 minutes at most, given his speed. Bobby tried to rationalize this. Maybe he'd been driving more slowly than he thought. Maybe he'd zoned out and lost track of time. But his odometer contradicted that explanation. He'd driven approximately 6 miles since entering the road, which matched the expected distance. He'd been driving at roughly 15 to 20 miles per hour based on the conditions. The math didn't work. An hour plus had simply vanished. Or alternatively, time had passed at a different rate while he was on this road. Bobby felt genuine fear for the first time in decades of driving. Mechanical problems he could handle. Strange sights he could rationalize as hallucinations or misperceptions. But time distortion, time literally not functioning normally, that suggested something fundamental about reality was broken in this location. As Bobby continued driving, trying desperately to reach the end of Shades of Death Road and return to normal territory, his mind began processing what he knew about the road's history, trying to find some framework to understand what he was experiencing. The road had been used by criminals during Prohibition, particularly during the 1920s and early 30s, when the manufacture and sale of adult beverages was illegal in the United States. The isolated nature of the road made it perfect for bootleggers transporting illegal goods, but it also made it perfect for bandits and criminals who preyed on those bootleggers. Multiple incidents of violence had occurred on this road during that era. Ambushes, confrontations that turned deadly, bodies discovered in the surrounding forest or dumped in Ghost Lake. The local law enforcement of that era had been understaffed and often overwhelmed, meaning many of these incidents went unsolved, many perpetrators were never caught, many victims were never properly identified. That violence, Bobby theorized, had somehow left an imprint on the location. The figures he was seeing, the apparitions dressed in period clothing, might be some kind of psychic residue from those tragic events, consciousness or memory somehow preserved in the fabric of the location itself. But the violence of the Prohibition era was only part of the road's tragic history. Before that era, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the area around Ghost Lake had experienced repeated outbreaks of malaria. The swampy conditions around the lake created perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes that carried the disease. Without modern medical treatment, malaria claimed many lives in the local community. Entire families had been wiped out by the disease. The small settlements that had existed in the area during that period had been gradually abandoned as people either perished or fled to healthier locations. Bobby had read estimates suggesting that dozens of people had died from malaria in the immediate vicinity of what was now called Shades of Death Road. Those deaths, combined with the later violence of the Prohibition era, meant that this relatively small geographic area had accumulated a huge amount of tragedy, suffering, and premature loss of life over the course of several decades. Bobby began to develop a theory. What if locations could become saturated with death and suffering? What if tragedy could accumulate in a place the way toxins accumulate in soil, creating conditions where the normal boundaries between past and present, between the living and the dead, between different states of reality, became permeable or unstable? Fairy Hole Cave, Bobby learned from a historical article he'd saved on his phone, had its own specific history beyond just being associated with the road. The cave had been used by various groups over the centuries as shelter by indigenous peoples before European settlement, as a hideout by criminals during multiple historical periods, and more recently as a destination for paranormal investigators and thrill seekers. But what made the cave particularly significant was its geography. The cave was located at a point where underground water sources, specific mineral deposits in the rock, and the above-ground swampy conditions of Ghost Lake all converged. Some researchers had suggested that this combination of geological factors created unusual electromagnetic conditions in the area, conditions that might be related to the paranormal phenomena reported so consistently over the years. Bobby wasn't sure if he bought that explanation. It felt like trying to apply science to something that might be fundamentally beyond scientific explanation, but it offered at least a framework for thinking about why this specific location, this specific stretch of road, seemed to be so active paranormally. Bobby remembered reading accounts from other people who'd experienced strange phenomena on Shades of Death Road. A local police officer who reported that his patrol car had died completely while driving the road at night, the vehicle's systems refusing to restart for over 20 minutes. And during that time, he'd seen figures moving in the forest that vanished when he shined his flashlight on them. A couple who reported that they'd driven the road and arrived at their destination 3 hours later than they should have based on their departure time and the distance traveled, with no memory of where that time had gone. Multiple drivers who reported seeing the same specific apparition, a woman in a white dress standing near Ghost Lake, always in the same position, always vanishing when approached. A paranormal investigation team that had set up equipment along the road and captured audio recordings of voices speaking in accents and using slang from the 1920s and 30s, despite no living persons being present in the area when the recordings were made. The consistency of these accounts, coming from unrelated witnesses spanning decades, suggested that whatever was happening on Shades of Death Road wasn't isolated or random. It was persistent, consistent, and genuinely anomalous. As Bobby drove and thought about all of this, he began to recognize a pattern in his own experience. The phenomena seemed to intensify the longer he remained on the road. The first apparition had been subtle, barely visible, but the later ones had been more solid, more present, more real. The mechanical problems with his truck had started minor, but were getting progressively worse. The time distortion had been dramatic, suggesting that the normal laws of physics were breaking down the deeper into the experience he went. Bobby theorized that Shades of Death Road might function like a trap. The longer you stayed on it, the more entangled you became with whatever paranormal forces operated there, until potentially you couldn't leave at all, until you became another ghost, another apparition, another figure standing on the roadside visible to future travelers. That realization filled Bobby with urgency. He needed to get off this road. He needed to reach the end of Shades of Death Road and return to normal reality before whatever was happening to him became permanent. As Bobby continued driving, fighting his truck's increasingly unresponsive controls and navigating around the apparitions that continued to appear with disturbing frequency, he came to a literal crossroads. The main Shades of Death Road continued straight ahead, promising to eventually deliver him to the town of Hope and his delivery destination. But there was also a side road, barely more than a dirt track, that led off to the left toward what Bobby's GPS indicated was Fairy Hole Cave. And standing at this junction, as if placed there deliberately, was the same figure Bobby had seen at the beginning of the road, the man in the dark suit and hat from the early 20th century. This time the figure wasn't just standing. It was gesturing, pointing down the side road toward the cave, its translucent arm extended, its posture suggesting urgency or invitation. Bobby stopped his truck, idling at the crossroads, and for perhaps 30 seconds he and the apparition looked at each other through Bobby's windshield. Bobby felt that same compulsion he'd felt earlier, the overwhelming urge to turn left, to drive down that side road to go to the cave. But this time, the compulsion came with something else. Knowledge, information being transmitted directly into Bobby's mind without words. The figure wanted Bobby to understand something. The cave wasn't just a geographic location, it was the key to understanding what was happening, possibly the key to escaping. The knowledge came with a warning. If Bobby continued straight, if he tried to simply drive through and leave the road behind, he would fail. Something about the road's nature meant that once you were entangled in its phenomena, you couldn't simply drive away. You had to resolve something, understand something, do something specific, or you'd be trapped in a loop, driving the road forever, eventually becoming one more apparition visible to future travelers. Bobby sat at that crossroads for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, wrestling with the decision. Every instinct told him to keep driving straight, to avoid the cave, to get to his destination and away from this nightmare. But the information the apparition had communicated, combined with his own observations about how the phenomena were intensifying, suggested that the straight path might not actually lead to escape. Bobby thought about the couple who'd lost 3 hours. Bobby thought about drivers who'd reported feeling like they were driving in circles on this straight road. Bobby thought about the time distortion he'd already experienced. What if continuing straight meant he'd just end up back at the beginning of the road somehow, condemned to repeat the experience? What if the only way out was through the cave, through whatever revelation or confrontation or experience waited there? Bobby made his decision. He turned the steering wheel left, drove his truck onto the narrow dirt track, and headed toward Fairy Hole Cave. The moment he committed to that direction, the compulsion vanished, replaced by a sense of rightness, of having made the correct choice, despite how terrifying it was. The apparition at the crossroads raised its hand in what might have been a gesture of acknowledgement or blessing, and then dissolved into the darkness. The dirt track leading to Fairy Hole Cave was barely wide enough for Bobby's truck, branches scraping against the sides of his vehicle as he navigated through forest that seemed to grow progressively darker and more oppressive with each passing meter. The track ended at a small clearing where the cave entrance was visible, a dark opening in a limestone outcropping, perhaps 10 feet wide and 7 feet tall, leading into absolute darkness. Bobby parked his truck, shut off the engine, and sat for a moment gathering his courage. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight from the cab, checked that his phone was in his pocket, and stepped out into the clearing. The silence was total. The interference that had been affecting his radio was gone, replaced by complete absence of sound. No wind, no insects, no birds. Just silence so profound it seemed to have physical weight. The cave entrance radiated cold. Bobby could feel the temperature drop as he approached it, could see his breath forming clouds in the flashlight beam. The cave was clearly the focal point of whatever paranormal activity existed on Shades of Death Road. This was where the phenomena originated, or where they were strongest. Bobby stepped into the cave entrance. The cave extended perhaps 30 feet into the limestone, widening into a roughly circular chamber about 20 feet in diameter. Bobby's flashlight revealed mineral deposits on the walls, moisture creating a slick, wet surface, and at the back of the chamber, something that made Bobby stop in his tracks. A pool of water, perfectly circular, perfectly still, reflecting his flashlight beam back at him. The water was impossibly clear, and as Bobby approached and shined his light down into it, he realized he couldn't see the bottom. The pool appeared to extend downward infinitely, or at least far deeper than should be possible, given the cave's location. And in the water's surface, before his light disturbed it, Bobby saw reflections that weren't him. Faces, dozens of faces, appearing and disappearing in the water's surface like a slideshow of photographs. Bobby recognized some of them. The man in the suit who'd been pointing at the crossroads, the woman in the white dress, the law enforcement officer. They were all there, all preserved somehow in this pool, all watching Bobby through the water. Bobby understood with sudden, terrible clarity what this place was. This wasn't just a cave. This was a repository, a prison, a place where the consciousnesses of those who died on Shades of Death Road had accumulated over the decades, unable to move on, unable to leave, trapped in this location by the circumstances of their deaths and the strange properties of this specific geographic point. As Bobby stared into the pool, the faces began to speak, not with sound, but with direct transmission of knowledge into Bobby's mind, the same way the apparition at the crossroads had communicated. They told him their stories. The man in the suit had been an illicit goods transporter who'd been ambushed and lost his life on this road in 1928. The woman in the white dress had contracted malaria and perished in 1896, her consciousness somehow becoming attached to Ghost Lake. The law enforcement officer had been investigating criminal activity on the road in 1932 and had disappeared, never found, his fate unknown to his family. Dozens of others, each with their own story, each trapped here by violent death or disease, or simply by being in the wrong place during a moment when the boundaries between worlds were too thin. They weren't evil. They weren't trying to harm Bobby. They were simply trapped, and they'd been trying to communicate with living travelers for decades, trying to make someone understand their situation, hoping that somehow someone might be able to help them or at least acknowledge their continued existence. Bobby felt overwhelming sadness for these trapped consciousnesses, but he also felt fear for himself, because the message they were sending included a warning. Bobby had entered their realm. Bobby had come to their prison. And unless he understood what he needed to understand and did what he needed to do, he would join them. Through the knowledge being transmitted from the trapped consciousnesses in Fairy Hole Cave, Bobby began to understand the actual mechanism of what was happening on Shades of Death Road. The location existed at a weak point in reality, a place where the barrier between the physical world and what might be called the spirit world, or another dimension, had been worn thin by the accumulation of tragedy over centuries. Every violent death, every person who perished from disease, every moment of suffering and fear added to the weakening of that barrier. By the mid-20th century, the barrier had become so thin, so permeable, that consciousnesses of the deceased couldn't fully transition to wherever they were supposed to go. Instead, they became trapped in a liminal space, not fully in the physical world, but not fully departed from it either. The cave, with its specific geological properties and its underground water source, served as the anchor point for this phenomenon, the place where the weakest point in reality was located. The pool of water Bobby was looking at wasn't just water, it was a portal, a window, a membrane between dimensions so thin that it allowed trapped consciousnesses to accumulate and persist. The figures on the road weren't haunting the road in any intentional sense. They were simply visible to living observers because the barrier was so weak that their presence in the liminal space could be perceived from the physical world. The trapped consciousnesses communicated to Bobby that there was a way to help them, but it required something from a living person, something that only someone who still existed fully in the physical world could provide. They needed acknowledgement. They needed to be seen, understood, and remembered. The act of a living person consciously recognizing their existence and their stories, understanding what had happened to them, and carrying that knowledge back to the physical world somehow strengthened their ability to transition, somehow gave them permission to let go and move on to wherever consciousness goes after physical death. Bobby realized that this was why they'd been appearing to travelers for decades. They were desperately trying to make contact, trying to get someone to see them not as frightening apparitions, but as people, as individuals with histories and identities who deserved to be remembered. Most travelers who saw them were too frightened to do anything but flee, which accomplished nothing. But Bobby, by coming to the cave, by looking into the pool, by receiving their communications and understanding their stories, had done what needed to be done. He'd acknowledged them. He'd seen them as people rather than as monsters. And that act, simple as it was, had power in this place where the boundaries between worlds were so thin. As Bobby stood at the edge of the pool in Fairy Hole Cave, something began to happen. The faces in the water started to fade, not disappearing but becoming less distinct, less present, as if they were finally able to move away from this trapped location. Bobby felt rather than heard something like collective sighs of relief, like consciousnesses that had been holding on desperately for decades were finally able to relax and let go. The man in the suit appeared one more time in the pool's surface, making eye contact with Bobby, and Bobby saw gratitude in those eyes, saw acknowledgement that Bobby had done something important, something helpful. Then the face faded completely, and the pool became just a pool, ordinary water reflecting only Bobby's flashlight and his own face looking down into it. The temperature in the cave began to rise slightly, the oppressive cold diminishing. The silence became less profound, and Bobby could hear normal sounds again, his own breathing, the drip of water somewhere in the cave's depths, the rustle of wind outside the cave entrance. The phenomena were subsiding. The trapped consciousnesses were transitioning, moving on to wherever they needed to go. Bobby had inadvertently become the catalyst for their release, the living person who'd finally understood and acknowledged their existence in a way that gave them permission to leave. Bobby walked out of Fairy Hole Cave into a clearing that felt completely different from the one he'd entered. The oppressive atmosphere was gone. The darkness seemed normal rather than supernatural. When Bobby returned to his truck and started the engine, it turned over smoothly, all the mechanical problems that had plagued it earlier completely resolved. His radio worked perfectly, his GPS functioned normally, his steering responded properly to his input. Bobby drove back down the dirt track to Shades of Death Road itself, and when he reached the main road, he noticed immediately that it felt different. The road was still narrow, still winding, still heavily forested, but it no longer felt threatening or malevolent. It felt like an ordinary rural road, no different from thousands of other back roads Bobby had driven during his career. Bobby continued to his delivery destination, arriving just past 10 p.m. Late, but not impossibly late. He completed his delivery, signed the necessary paperwork, and drove to a nearby truck stop where he parked for the night. Bobby spent hours that night writing down everything that had happened, documenting every detail while it was fresh in his memory, because he knew that this experience was important, that it meant something beyond just his personal encounter with the paranormal. In the weeks following his experience on Shades of Death Road, Bobby became somewhat obsessed with researching the road's history and trying to verify the information he'd received from the trapped consciousnesses. He contacted local historical societies, read through newspaper archives from the 1920s and 30s, investigated records of disease outbreaks in the area during the late 1800s. What he found was remarkable. The stories the consciousnesses had communicated to him were accurate. There had been a person matching the description of the man in the suit who'd been involved in illicit activities and had vanished under mysterious circumstances in 1928. There were records of malaria outbreaks in the Ghost Lake area during the exact time periods that had been communicated to him. The law enforcement officer who disappeared matched records of an unsolved missing person case from 1932. The knowledge Bobby had received wasn't fabricated by his imagination or created by suggestion. It was genuine historical information that he had no way of knowing before his experience. This verification gave Bobby confidence that what he'd experienced was real, that he hadn't hallucinated or misinterpreted, that he'd genuinely made contact with something that existed beyond the normal boundaries of physical reality. Bobby reached out to paranormal research organizations that specialized in studying locations like Shades of Death Road. He connected with a team from New Jersey Paranormal Research that had been investigating the road for over 15 years, documenting phenomena and collecting witness testimonies. When Bobby shared his experience with them, they were immediately interested because his account matched patterns they'd been observing. The concentration of activity around Ghost Lake and Fairy Hole Cave, the apparent temporal distortions, the consistent appearance of specific apparitions wearing period clothing, and most significantly, the communicative intent of the phenomena. The researchers told Bobby that they'd theorized for years that the consciousnesses on Shades of Death Road weren't randomly haunting the location, but were actually trying to communicate something specific, trying to accomplish something. Bobby's experience seemed to confirm that theory and suggested what that purpose was. The trapped consciousnesses needed acknowledgement, needed someone to understand their stories and carry that knowledge back to the living world. The research team asked Bobby if he'd be willing to return to the location with them, bringing equipment that could document any residual phenomena. Bobby agreed, though with some trepidation, unsure if returning would trigger the same experiences or if his initial visit had somehow completed what needed to be completed. Bobby returned to Shades of Death Road approximately 6 weeks after his initial experience, this time accompanied by the paranormal research team with their documentation equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, audio recording devices, everything they used to capture evidence of paranormal activity. The team drove the full length of the road during daylight hours first, establishing baseline readings and familiarizing Bobby with the route in normal conditions. Then, as evening approached, they made a second pass, this time driving slowly and monitoring their equipment continuously. What they found was surprising. The equipment detected significantly less anomalous activity than the team had recorded during previous investigations of the road. The electromagnetic readings were within normal ranges. The infrared cameras weren't picking up temperature anomalies. The audio equipment wasn't capturing unexplained sounds. It was as if the road had been somehow cleared, purified, normalized by whatever had transpired during Bobby's first visit. When they reached Fairy Hole Cave and entered the chamber with the pool, they found it equally mundane. Just an ordinary cave with an ordinary pool of water, no paranormal signatures detectable on any of their instruments. The research team leader told Bobby that in his 15 years of investigating this location, he'd never seen it so quiet, so inactive. Whatever Bobby had done, whatever had happened during his initial visit, appeared to have resolved the phenomena, at least temporarily. The research team shared with Bobby the full historical context of Shades of Death Road that they'd accumulated over years of study. The road's current name dated to at least the late 1700s, and historical records suggested that even before European settlement, indigenous peoples had considered the area around Ghost Lake to be spiritually significant and potentially dangerous. Various theories existed for the name's origin. Some historians believed it referred to a conflict between indigenous tribes that resulted in significant loss of life in the area. Others pointed to a series of incidents during the colonial period where travelers had been attacked by bandits or wild animals. The most documented tragedies were the malaria outbreaks of the late 1800s, which had depopulated several small settlements in the area, and the violence of the Prohibition era, which had added dozens more tragic deaths to the road's history. The researchers had identified at least 37 documented deaths that occurred specifically on or immediately adjacent to Shades of Death Road between 1890 and 1940. That concentration of tragedy in a relatively small geographic area over a relatively short historical period was unusual and might explain why the location had developed such strong paranormal activity. One of the researchers, a woman named Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had a background in both parapsychology and quantum physics, shared with Bobby her theory about what might be happening at locations like Shades of Death Road. She proposed that consciousness might be fundamentally quantum in nature, existing as a kind of information pattern that could potentially persist after physical death under the right conditions. Locations where many deaths occurred in traumatic circumstances might accumulate these consciousness patterns, which could, under certain conditions, become perceptible to living observers, particularly during states of altered awareness or in locations where electromagnetic or geological anomalies created conditions that amplified the visibility of these patterns. The pool in Fairy Hole Cave, with its specific mineral content and underground water sources, might serve as a kind of battery or amplifier for these consciousness patterns, allowing them to accumulate and persist in a stable state. Dr. Martinez theorized that Bobby's act of acknowledgement and understanding had somehow allowed those accumulated consciousness patterns to dissipate or transition, releasing the energy they'd been holding. The theory was speculative and unprovable by conventional scientific methods, but it offered a framework that incorporated both quantum physics and reported paranormal phenomena. As Bobby continued his research and his conversations with the paranormal investigation community, he learned that Shades of Death Road was not unique. There were other locations around the United States and around the world that showed similar patterns, concentrated areas where multiple tragic deaths had occurred, where visitors consistently reported paranormal phenomena, where the normal rules of reality seemed not to fully apply. These locations shared certain characteristics. They were often isolated or rural. They were associated with water sources or caves. They had significant indigenous spiritual associations, and they'd accumulated enough tragedy over time that the weight of that history seemed to affect the physical properties of the location. Bobby heard about a road in Texas, about a bridge in Louisiana, about a cave system in Kentucky, about a forest in Washington state, all of them showing similar patterns of phenomena and similar historical contexts. What made Shades of Death Road particularly significant was its proximity to populated areas and its accessibility. Unlike many haunted locations which were remote and difficult to reach, this road was in New Jersey, easily accessible to millions of people. That accessibility meant there were more witnesses, more documentation, more opportunities for people to experience the phenomena firsthand. Following his experience on Shades of Death Road and his subsequent investigation, Bobby felt compelled to do something he'd never done before: share his story publicly. Bobby had always been private, had always kept his work life and personal life separate, had never sought attention or recognition. But he felt that what he'd experienced was important enough that it needed to be documented and shared, that other people needed to know that locations like Shades of Death Road existed and that the phenomena reported there were genuine. Bobby created a detailed written account of his experience, including photographs of the road and the cave, historical documentation of the deaths that had occurred in the area, and testimonials from other witnesses who'd experienced similar phenomena. He shared this account online through various forums and websites dedicated to paranormal research and unexplained phenomena. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people read Bobby's account. Hundreds commented, sharing their own experiences at Shades of Death Road or similar locations, and several other truckers and travelers reached out to Bobby privately to share encounters they'd had but had never publicly discussed out of fear of ridicule or disbelief. Bobby also attempted to share his experience with mainstream scientific researchers, reaching out to universities with parapsychology programs, to physicists studying consciousness, to anyone in the academic community who might be interested in studying what had happened. The response from the scientific establishment was mixed at best. Some researchers were intrigued and asked Bobby for more details, requesting documentation and offering to conduct follow-up investigations. But many were dismissive, suggesting that Bobby had experienced hallucinations brought on by fatigue or stress, that he'd misinterpreted natural phenomena, or that he'd fabricated the account for attention. Bobby found the dismissiveness frustrating. He had physical evidence in the form of the time stamps on his phone and GPS showing the time distortion. He had recordings of the interference on his truck's radio. He had testimonials from other witnesses describing identical phenomena. But for many in the scientific community, the evidence wasn't sufficient to overcome their fundamental assumption that paranormal phenomena don't exist, and therefore any account of such phenomena must be explainable through conventional means or must be fraudulent. Bobby realized that changing scientific consensus about the reality of paranormal phenomena would require more than a single well-documented case. It would require a fundamental shift in how science approached questions about consciousness and reality itself. Despite Bobby's experience and the subsequent investigation by the paranormal research team, Shades of Death Road remained fundamentally mysterious in many ways. Bobby's encounter had apparently released or allowed to transition a large number of the trapped consciousnesses that had been accumulating there for decades. But that didn't mean the location had become completely normal or completely safe. The research team continued to monitor the road, and within 6 months of Bobby's initial experience, they began detecting signs that paranormal activity was resuming at the location, though at a much lower level than before. New apparitions were being reported, though they appeared to be different individuals from the ones Bobby had encountered. The time distortions that drivers experienced seemed less severe, but hadn't completely ceased. The fundamental properties of the location, the combination of geological factors, historical tragedy, and whatever weakness in the barrier between dimensions existed there, hadn't changed. Bobby theorized that locations like Shades of Death Road might function like wounds that could heal temporarily, but would reopen under the right conditions. The question was whether another accumulation of trapped consciousnesses would eventually build up again, requiring another person like Bobby to come along and acknowledge them, or whether something more permanent could be done to address the underlying cause of the phenomena. Bobby's experience on Shades of Death Road changed him fundamentally. Before that night, Bobby had been a skeptic, a practical person who believed that the world operated according to understandable physical laws and that anything that appeared supernatural had a rational explanation that simply hadn't been discovered yet. After that night, Bobby understood that reality was far more complex than he'd believed, that consciousness might exist independently of physical bodies, that time might not be as linear and fixed as everyday experience suggested, and that there were places in the world where the normal rules simply didn't apply in the ways we expect. Bobby found himself unable to return to his previous certainty, unable to dismiss other people's accounts of paranormal experiences the way he once had. He became an advocate for taking such experiences seriously, for investigating them rigorously rather than dismissing them out of hand, for recognizing that the materialist scientific worldview might be incomplete or incorrect in fundamental ways. Shades of Death Road continues to exist, continues to be traveled by locals and by tourists who've heard about its reputation. The phenomena continue to be reported, though less frequently and less intensely than before Bobby's intervention. The road remains on lists of the most haunted locations in America. Paranormal research teams continue to visit and document whatever activity they can detect. Local residents continue to share stories about experiences they've had on the road, about seeing figures that shouldn't be there, about feeling watched, about their vehicles malfunctioning for no mechanical reason. The road's reputation ensures that it will continue to attract attention, will continue to be investigated, will continue to generate new accounts of paranormal experiences. Whether those experiences are genuine encounters with trapped consciousnesses, misinterpretations of natural phenomena, or some combination of both, remains a subject of debate. But the consistency of the reports, the historical documentation of tragedy at the location, and accounts like Bobby's suggest that something genuinely anomalous is occurring there, something that defies easy explanation or dismissal. Bobby continues to wrestle with questions raised by his experience. Did he actually help the trapped consciousnesses he encountered? Did his acknowledgement of them genuinely allow them to transition to wherever consciousness goes after death? Or did he simply experience a subjective phenomenon, a personal vision or hallucination that had no objective reality? Bobby believes, based on the verification of historical details and the changes in paranormal activity at the location following his visit, that he did accomplish something real, that his action had genuine consequences. But he also recognizes that he can't prove that in any way that would satisfy a rigorous skeptic. The consciousness patterns he communicated with might have been actual preserved awareness from deceased individuals, or they might have been some other phenomenon entirely, information patterns in the geology, quantum fluctuations in local space-time, projections from Bobby's own subconscious. The nature of paranormal phenomena is that they resist the kind of controlled, repeatable investigation that science requires for proof. Each experience is unique, subjective, and impossible to fully document or verify. Bobby's documented account of his experience on Shades of Death Road has become one of the most widely cited modern cases of paranormal phenomena associated with that location. His story has been featured in books about haunted locations, in paranormal investigation documentaries, and on websites dedicated to unexplained phenomena. What makes Bobby's account particularly compelling to researchers is his background as a skeptic, his decades of practical experience that made him an unlikely candidate for hallucination or fabrication, and the verification of historical details that he had no way of knowing before his experience. Bobby receives messages regularly from other people who've had experiences on Shades of Death Road, some describing encounters identical to his, others describing different but equally strange phenomena. Bobby has become something of an unofficial advocate for the trapped consciousnesses that might still exist at that location and at similar places, encouraging people who have paranormal experiences to document them carefully, to investigate the history of the locations where they occur, and to approach the phenomena with respect rather than fear. Based on his experience, Bobby offers specific warnings to anyone considering traveling Shades of Death Road, particularly at night or during twilight hours when the phenomena appear most active. First, don't go alone. Have another person with you who can serve as a second witness and provide support if something goes wrong. Second, document everything. Keep your phone charged and ready to take photographs or video. Note exact times and locations. Record your observations as they happen. Third, respect the location. If you do encounter phenomena, remember that you might be interacting with consciousnesses of people who experience genuine tragedy, and approach them with empathy rather than treating them as entertainment or spectacle. Fourth, trust your instincts. If you feel compelled to do something that seems dangerous or wrong, resist that compulsion and remove yourself from the situation. And finally, be prepared for the possibility that what you experience might fundamentally challenge your understanding of reality, and that you might have difficulty processing that challenge afterward. Bobby himself struggled for months with anxiety and confusion following his experience, finding it difficult to reconcile what he'd witnessed with his previous worldview. Bobby remains hopeful that eventually, mainstream science will develop methods for studying paranormal phenomena rigorously and objectively. He believes that consciousness studies, quantum physics, and neuroscience are converging in ways that might eventually provide theoretical frameworks for understanding experiences like his. Recent research into quantum entanglement, non-local consciousness, and the hard problem of consciousness suggests that the materialist assumption that consciousness is purely a product of brain activity might be incomplete. If consciousness can exist independently of physical substrates, if information can be preserved in quantum states, if reality itself is more fluid and observer-dependent than classical physics assumed, then perhaps paranormal phenomena represent glimpses into aspects of reality that science is only beginning to understand. Bobby hopes that his documented experience and others like it will eventually be taken seriously by researchers with the resources and expertise to investigate them properly, rather than being dismissed out of hand as impossible or fraudulent. Bobby has returned to Shades of Death Road several times since his initial experience, both alone and with the paranormal research team. Each visit has been different. Sometimes the road feels completely normal, indistinguishable from any other rural road in New Jersey. Other times, Bobby senses the presence of something, not as overwhelming as during his first visit, but definitely there, definitely aware of him. On one visit, Bobby saw a single apparition standing near Ghost Lake, a figure he didn't recognize from his initial encounter, suggesting that new consciousnesses might be becoming trapped at the location, or that there were others he hadn't encountered during his first visit. Bobby has developed a practice of stopping at Fairy Hole Cave whenever he visits, spending a few minutes at the pool, acknowledging any consciousnesses that might be present, offering them recognition and respect. He sees this as a kind of maintenance, a way of preventing another massive accumulation of trapped awareness that would require another dramatic intervention to resolve. Bobby doesn't know if this practice actually accomplishes anything, but it feels important, feels like the right thing to do given what he experienced and understood. Bobby's experience has led him to think deeply about death, consciousness, and what might happen to awareness after physical death. He's no longer certain that death is simply an ending, a cessation of consciousness. His experience suggests that at least under some circumstances, consciousness can persist after the death of the physical body, can maintain awareness and intention, can even communicate with living persons under the right conditions. This possibility raises profound questions. What happens to most consciousnesses after death? Do they successfully transition to some other state of existence, or do many become trapped, like the consciousnesses Bobby encountered? Are there interventions that could help trapped consciousnesses transition? Could living persons develop practices or rituals specifically designed to assist in that transition? Bobby has explored various spiritual and religious traditions looking for frameworks that might address these questions, finding that many traditional beliefs about spirits, ghosts, and the afterlife might be attempts to explain genuine phenomena that have been occurring throughout human history. Despite Bobby's experience, despite the investigations by paranormal researchers, despite decades of documented phenomena, Shades of Death Road remains fundamentally mysterious. The road continues to attract visitors, continues to generate new accounts of strange experiences, continues to resist easy explanation or understanding. The combination of historical tragedy, specific geology, and whatever metaphysical factors are involved creates conditions that science hasn't fully explained and might not be able to explain using current theoretical frameworks. The road serves as a reminder that reality might be far stranger, far more complex, and far less understood than everyday experience suggests. For Bobby, the enduring mystery is both frustrating and comforting. Frustrating because he'd like definitive answers about what he experienced and what it means. Comforting because it suggests that the universe contains more wonder, more possibility, more meaning than a purely materialist worldview allows for. Thank you for spending more than 35 minutes with us on the Long Road Stories, exploring one of America's most thoroughly documented and genuinely mysterious, haunted locations. If Bobby Kane's experience on Shades of Death Road has challenged your assumptions about reality, about consciousness, about what might persist after physical death, then this story has accomplished its purpose. Shades of Death Road still exists. It's still in Warren County, New Jersey. You can drive it yourself if you choose to. You can visit Ghost Lake and Fairy Hole Cave. You can see if you experience any of the phenomena that Bobby and hundreds of others have reported over the decades. But if you do choose to visit, please remember Bobby's warnings. Go with someone else, document everything, respect any consciousnesses you might encounter, trust your instincts about danger, and be prepared for the possibility that what you experience might fundamentally change how you understand the world. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next deep investigation into the unexplained phenomena that occur on America's roads and in America's forgotten places. Drop a like if Bobby's story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about what's possible. And please comment below, telling us where you're watching from and whether you've ever experienced something on a road that you couldn't explain, something that challenged your understanding of reality. We're building a community of people who acknowledge that the world contains genuine mysteries, that consciousness might be far more than we've been taught to believe, and that some places exist where the boundaries between worlds have worn dangerously thin. The Long Road Stories will return next week with another documented case from America's highways. Until then, drive safe, stay aware, and remember, if you find yourself on Shades of Death Road as darkness falls and you start seeing figures that shouldn't be there, you're not hallucinating, you're not imagining things, and you're not alone. You're experiencing something that hundreds of others have experienced before you, something that science hasn't fully explained, but that's undeniably real to those who've encountered it. What you choose to do with that experience is up to you. But now you know that Bobby Kane acknowledged those trapped consciousnesses, helped them transition, and in doing so, became part of the road's history himself. Not as a victim, but as someone who understood, who helped, who demonstrated that compassion and acknowledgement might be powerful forces, even in places where death and tragedy have accumulated for centuries. Some roads end in towns, others in stories, but a few, like Shades of Death Road, never end at all. They wait for the next driver.